All right, guys. So, the chip war is getting nastier by the day, and the US needs to keep the music playing for as long as possible. We are officially inside a semiconductor bubble, and the numbers behind it are more alarming than most financial analysts are willing to say out loud. This analysis draws on publicly reported data and open source industry information, so let us walk through exactly what the evidence shows. Just look at Micron's stock, up over 250% in less than 6 months, which is the kind of move that does not happen in a healthy, stable market. Part of that surge came from a real shortage of raw materials triggered by the COVID shutdown, but a significant part of it is pure speculative hype. The belief that AI demand will be endless and unstoppable, and that nothing in the world can slow it down, is doing a lot of work in these valuations. And when you see Jensen Huang dancing the way he has been at public events, it triggers a very specific kind of market memory for anyone who has been around long enough. It reminds experienced investors of Bill Gates doing his famous dance at the absolute peak of the dot-com bubble, right before it all came apart. You do not dance like that and think that everything is running on a completely normal, sustainable trajectory, and we are watching that same pattern form in real time. Now here's what makes this bubble different from the dot-com era. There is real demand underneath it, real AI infrastructure spending, and that makes the distortion much harder to see and correct. NVIDIA is not just sitting back enjoying the ride, they are actively pumping up demand and doing everything possible to ride this wave even higher. They are now moving into the consumer laptop market, pushing to make the actual hardware itself, the physical computers that sit on desks and in backpacks across America. This is a direct challenge to Intel and AMD for the personal computing market, a fight that is going to reshape who controls the most important hardware in everyday American life. Selling chips exclusively to data centers is not profitable enough for Jensen, especially after losing access to half of the world's total addressable market, which is China. So now he wants Blackwell RTX chips sitting inside household laptops across America, Europe, and Southeast Asia. But this creates a serious structural problem the market is not pricing in. Consumer laptops need standard memory chips, the kind produced at scale for decades that power the devices most people use every day. Data centers need high bandwidth memory, or HBM, for the intensive parallel processing that AI workloads demand. And these are completely different products requiring different manufacturing setups. Global memory companies have been steadily reallocating their standard memory production lines toward HBM for AI data centers, following the money to the higher margins. They are currently using roughly 3 times more silicon wafers to produce one HBM chip than for standard memory. That ratio alone tells the whole supply story. Which means standard memory chip supply was already getting squeezed long before NVIDIA decided to enter the laptop market and stack massive new demand on top of it. Prices for both types of memory are going to climb even higher as a result, inflating the bubble further and making the eventual correction more severe. If you are watching from the US, drop your state in the comments right now, and if you are watching from anywhere else, drop your country below. This is not a healthy market dynamic. It is a bubble stacking on top of another bubble, and the weight of that stacking is compressing something underneath. If China steps in with a credible supply solution, which we are going to break down in detail, the unwinding of this bubble could be sudden and extremely violent. Now let us talk about what the United States is actually doing in response, because the strategy has real consequences that mainstream financial coverage is glossing over. The US is moving to ban all advanced AI chips from reaching any Chinese company, and the scope of that ban is broader than most people realize. This is not just a restriction on exports to companies physically based in mainland China. It follows the company's ownership structure, not just their geographic location. If you are a Chinese-owned technology company operating out of offices in Malaysia, Singapore, or anywhere else in the world, you cannot import US AI chips under this framework. Chinese companies are deeply frustrated about this, and there is a specific reason why. Many of them built their international office structures with this moment in mind. Part of the strategy for many Chinese tech firms was always to access US computing infrastructure while China developed its own domestic chips over time. The US is now shutting that runway down entirely, which triggers a response that accelerates the exact dynamic these restrictions were designed to slow down. The scope keeps expanding. The US could extend restrictions to target Chinese companies renting computing power through third-party data centers across Asia, which would widen the conflict further still. Here is the fundamental problem with the current approach, and even Jensen Huang himself will not underestimate China's ability to respond. He said it plainly. China has very good AI technology. Approximately 50% of the world's AI researchers are Chinese, and the most widely used open-source AI models right now came from China. They are moving very fast, and trade restrictions do not slow down engineering talent. They concentrate it on a single national priority with essentially unlimited government backing behind it. Now, Huawei is doing something that deserves far more technical attention than it is currently getting. They are ditching the traditional method of chip development entirely. Instead of shrinking the physical size of transistors the way TSMC and Intel do, pushing further down the nanometer scale, China is taking a fundamentally different approach to the physics. They are shrinking the time it takes for electrical signals to travel through the chip by folding circuits on top of one another in three-dimensional layers, rather than laying them flat. By 2031, Huawei believes this approach produces chips fully comparable in real-world performance to what the US and Taiwan are producing with their most advanced processes today. That is fewer than 5 years from now, and it means the capability gap may close significantly before the current policy framework has time to prove or disprove its effectiveness. Subscribe now if you want to stay ahead of this story, because the second part breaks down where the numbers get truly uncomfortable for American taxpayers and investors alike. Now let us get into the energy dimension, because this is where China's structural advantage becomes genuinely difficult to counter through policy alone. If you have been watching since the beginning of this video, you already understand that the chip war is not just a technology competition. It is an infrastructure competition, an energy competition, and a materials competition happening simultaneously. And the United States is playing catch-up in at least 2 of those 3 dimensions right now, regardless of what the stock prices suggest about the current state of play. The United States would need to add an entire additional U.S. economy's worth of power generation capacity just to meet projected AI demand over the next 5 years. Read that again. Not an additional power plant, not additional capacity in specific regions, an entire additional U.S. economy's worth of power generation, just for AI infrastructure demand alone. That is not a marginal gap. That is a civilizational scale challenge requiring years of environmental permitting, construction timelines, grid integration work, and regulatory approvals to even approach. China, by contrast, is projected to have more than 3 times the power generation advantage over the US by 2030, built on decades of centrally directed infrastructure investment that did not require navigating a fragmented permitting system. Cheaper and abundant power means China can iterate through chip development cycles at a fraction of the cost the US and its allies face at every stage of the process. Every mistake in a development cycle is affordable when power costs a fraction of what American data centers pay, and every iteration gets faster when you are not waiting on grid capacity to come online. The US simply cannot match that energy math through market mechanisms alone. It would require the kind of centralized national commitment that the American political system has consistently struggled to organize around single, long-term goals. And while that gap widens every year, China is targeting the memory chip market as the very next front in this economic conflict. And the pricing data tells you everything you need to know about how serious that threat already is. From September of last year through May of this year, prices for RAM and standard memory chips exploded somewhere between 300% and 700% depending on the product category. Price increases of that magnitude attract competition the way blood attracts sharks. The margins are simply too visible and too large for global competitors to ignore. China sees those margins clearly, and they are already moving in ways that should concern every investor currently riding the memory chip bubble. China's CXMT memory chips are already on the market today, selling for approximately $150 per module, while the global average from Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron sits at $300 to $400. That is a 50% price discount available right now to any company willing to source from a Chinese manufacturer, and some American companies are already doing exactly that to protect their margins. The cost savings are simply too large to ignore when you are trying to stay competitive in a hardware market. That is not politics, that is basic corporate math playing out in real time. CMT is not standing still. They are preparing for a major IPO targeting up to $5 billion in fresh capital, every dollar of which goes directly into ramping production and advancing their technology. With full Chinese government backing behind them, this is only going to scale faster, and it is only a matter of time before Chinese memory chips flood global supply chains at prices the market leaders cannot match. When that happens, the memory chip bubble deflates rapidly, and the stocks that rode the shortage narrative up by 200% to 700% may find they have a very long way to fall. Now, here is the part of this story that goes deeper than finished chips, and it is the part that should make every American investor and every American taxpayer genuinely uncomfortable.
China has set an extremely aggressive target for silicon wafer self-sufficiency, and the deadline for that target is essentially now, not a distant future date on a policy roadmap. Silicon wafers are the foundational raw material that every semiconductor in the world is built on, with no meaningful substitute at current manufacturing scales. You either have the silicon or you do not make chips. It is that clear, and the current geography of silicon supply is deeply uncomfortable for the American position in this conflict. Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea currently dominate silicon wafer production, but Beijing has set a formal target of 70% domestic self-sufficiency by 2026, and their track record on infrastructure goals is consistent. China already controls close to 80% of global raw silicon production and approximately 75% of ultra-high purity polysilicon supply, the refined material that both AI chips and memory chips depend on. The United States and its allies are currently dependent on Chinese goodwill for that material, while simultaneously engaged in an active technology conflict with China. The US is attempting to squeeze China with chip export restrictions while depending on China for 80% of the raw silicon those chips are made from. That structural contradiction does not survive a serious crisis intact. US and South Korean chipmakers reportedly understand this exposure and are alarmed about supply chain security, even as their stock prices continue hitting record highs quarter after quarter. The disconnect between what financial markets are pricing and what supply chain engineers actually know is one of the most striking features of this entire moment. If China restricts silicon exports, and they have already demonstrated willingness to restrict critical mineral exports in other domains when the political calculation called for it, chip production across the US, South Korea, and Taiwan faces serious disruption fast. The entire AI infrastructure build-out the major hyperscalers are committing to could be placed at real risk. And we are not talking about small capital exposure. There is approximately $1 trillion in data center investment currently planned, all of it dependent on a continuous supply of chips to fill those facilities with functional hardware. Without chips, those data centers become extraordinarily expensive empty buildings, massive capital commitments with no productive capacity, and no path to the returns that justified building them. China does not even need to win the chip manufacturing race outright to inflict serious damage on the US position. They just need to be willing to turn off the raw material tap. Now, here's what most coverage misses entirely, and it explains why China's advantage is not a temporary gap, but a compounding structural lead that grows wider with time. China operates more than 11 dedicated universities focused specifically on rare earths and critical materials science, triple the number of comparable research institutions in the rest of the world combined. These are not general chemistry programs. Students are explicitly taught about the geopolitical importance of critical materials and how Chinese-controlled resources end up inside American defense systems and technology infrastructure. They learn in the classroom why controlling these supply chains matters for China's national future, which creates a workforce that understands the strategic dimension of their technical work at every level. This background makes those researchers significantly less likely to share knowledge with foreign competitors or accept positions at Western companies, regardless of the compensation offered. China has also implemented travel restrictions on supply chain expertise, ring-fencing that knowledge inside Chinese borders in a systematic way that makes external recruitment increasingly ineffective. The United States is attempting to build its own rare earth education system, and that effort is real, but it faces a foundational problem that classroom investment alone cannot solve. Without active domestic mines and operational refineries running inside the country, you cannot teach hands-on extraction and processing skills in any meaningful way. It is like trying to teach petroleum engineering without a working refinery. You can build the classroom, but the knowledge stays theoretical without the physical operation to practice in. China's advantage here compounds with every passing year, because their students are getting hands-on experience in active facilities, while American students are working from textbooks about a supply chain they cannot access. So let us pull back and look at where all of this leads, because the full picture is more serious than any single data point makes it appear in isolation. Every sanction the US imposes triggers a blowback effect. More Chinese government investment, more engineering focus, and faster closing of the technology gap than would have happened without the pressure. Reports are already circulating of Chinese universities with military ties attempting to source NVIDIA chips through indirect channels. Nothing has been confirmed as wrongdoing, but reports like that draw Washington's attention immediately. And Washington's attention leads to more restrictions. More restrictions lead to more Chinese innovation spending. More Chinese innovation spending closes the technology gap faster, and the cycle accelerates.
Both sides are locked into this dynamic in ways that make stepping back politically very difficult for anyone with a stake in the outcome, which is essentially every major economy on Earth. Meanwhile, the semiconductor bubble keeps inflating on the surface. Micron up over 200%, memory chip prices up between 300% and 700%, valuations that treat the shortage as permanent. But underneath that surface, Chinese memory chips, already 50% cheaper and entering mainstream Western hardware supply chains right now. China controlling 80% of the raw silicon the entire industry depends on. A 3D chip architecture from Huawei that sidesteps the traditional transistor race. An energy infrastructure gap that no policy announcement can close on a useful timeline. And a rare earth education system in China that is 3 generations ahead of what the US is starting to build today. The question this leaves every investor, every taxpayer, and every policymaker with is genuinely uncomfortable and does not have a clean answer. If China holds the trigger on the silicon supply chain and can inflict serious damage on the entire US AI build-out without even winning the chip race, what is the actual strategy for the American side? Is the current approach of export restrictions accelerating Chinese innovation faster than it is slowing Chinese access to American technology? And is the semiconductor bubble inflating in a market where the most important raw material is controlled by the country you are trying to exclude? Let me know what you think in the comments below. When do you think China makes its move on the silicon supply chain? And does the current US strategy actually slow them down or speed them up? Drop your country or state in the comments, because this conversation looks different depending on where you sit in the global supply chain. Stay safe, hit subscribe, and we will be right here covering every development as it unfolds.